a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and I'm joined with co-hosts. I think maybe all of us are hosts now. We've been doing this series on the Bible, and we will continue to do so. Dr. Larry Garrity, former president of La Sierra University, longtime archaeologist, primarily in Jordan, but also in other countries in the Middle East. And Dr. Camp Bramlett, who is Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra University. Also, what, 20 years now we can talk about? Maybe we're moving on to 21 years of involvement in archaeology. And I think if we totaled our time, it would be over 100 years that we together have been working in archaeology. And also interests in the Old Testament, study in the Old Testament in particular, but of course the Bible is, the whole Bible is of interest to us, especially as we're thinking about archaeology and archaeological connections. We have been working our way through the Bible book by book. And have been taking our time. This has been not maybe a leisurely stroll, but we have been spending quite a bit of time. And now we turn to the book of Joshua. And we will be spending 3 episodes with the book of Joshua. First response to the book of Joshua. How does that strike you? Is that a favorite book? Is that something you read late at night? Is that something you just use for classes? What does Joshua mean?
Well, it gives me pause for thought, I guess. The degree that violence seems to be condoned, even required. I think that's, for me at least, that's a cause for reflection. What's really going on in the text?
Right. So the ethical issue, well, a lot of ethical issues surrounding that violence and how it's used. Okay, Larry?
I've always preferred it to judges. I know that's hard for you to hear because you're sort of a specialist
we'll
in
talk
Judges.
About that.
But to me, Judges is the goriest book. But and I don't like all the warfare and violence in Joshua either. But you know, as a kid, you grow up singing about Joshua at the Battle of Jericho and so on, and so there are exciting stories that come out of Joshua. And it's certainly important to the history of Israel, so it's got to be reckoned with.
See, I would say that at least in Judges, there's these sort of disclaimers about the violence. But in Joshua, this is God's command.
That's true.
Well, does it give you any indication of which book I like the best? In that we're doing 3 episodes of Joshua and 7 of Judges. Does that give any idea? You're right, though. The book of Judges has been a source of study for me for several years, and the archaeology of the time period. In fact, I think this time period means something to all of us. The time we call the early Iron Age. Well, the late Bronze Age, end of the late Bronze Age, and the early Iron Age. So we're talking about, what, 1200 to 1000, something like that. And that's of interest to all of us. Before we turn to the book and its challenges, I mean, we face with the book of Joshua, I mean, the kinds of ethical issues, but some important challenges archaeologically, and we want to talk about those. But before we do so, we have some artifacts in front of us, and metal on the table in front of you, Kent, and you, Larry. So talk to us about those, and then we'll move over to this table.
Well, these are weapons. And we have different categories of weapons. Now, most of these are bronze because bronze survives better than iron does. Copper, bronze, mostly being copper, does oxidize, but not to the extent or rapidness that iron does. So we have different categories. We have, short weapons that would be handheld like swords and daggers. Spears here really of different sizes. And javelins, which are good for poking between the armor, which the spears can't cut through. And then the really close range ones, for the battle axes that are to take out your enemy once you are in physical proximity to him.
And don't forget these little things here.
Yes, different kinds of arrowheads. Some have a very thin tang on them that could be connected to the arrow.
Right.
Others, the arrow is enclosed in the arrowhead.
We move to the book of Joshua, and we have to talk about weapons.
Right.
For the reasons that you've stated already.
And these are all biblical era weapons and pottery and stone objects and so on that are here on these tables. So they're appropriate to the times we're talking about.
Now, if we move over to this table, it is mace heads that we have in front of me. These are stone, a wooden handle on them, again, for close combat, right? Face-to-face combat. And then probably sling stones. We call them ballista for ballistic use. Although, if one picks these up and sees something of smoothness, one needs to think about something other than just a military use. Probably a kitchen implement for pounding and maybe with herbs and so on for pounding, making them into powder. So these have double purposes, and one is nourishment and health and well-being, and the other one is watch out or you might end up with a big dent in your head. And then we have some pottery over here. Kent, tell us about this.
Well, these are typical forms, most of them from the late Bronze Age, contemporary with Joshua. A bowl, small pitchers. We have one small one in the front there in the middle that would be an imported container with some sort of ointment inside. And then my favorite form is actually slightly earlier, at the end of the Middle Bronze, maybe 1600 BC.
In terms of design, it never gets better than that.
It doesn't. That's the peak.
Excellent. So, we think about a book like Joshua, and we think about the stories. You mentioned the stories, and it is true. What kind of book is this? I mean, all of the literature in the Bible is, first of all, literature. That's what it is. Human beings, we would say inspired by God, but human beings used literary conventions that were standard, that people understood. What is the book of Joshua? To what genre might we assign this book?
You know, right off the bat, I want to say we would be lost in terms of a good understanding of the book without archaeology and the kind of literature that we know about now from the Near Eastern world that we didn't used to know anything about. And so I think that those two things have really helped us categorize Joshua in a better way than we've been able to before. And a friend of mine has suggested that it's really, the whole book is like a land grant. It's God's way of telling the people what he's giving them for their homeland. And maybe 3 centuries earlier than this, up along the coast of Syria, we have a similar land grant that came from the Hittite god to his people that he was giving that area to. So we've got some parallels from the ancient world that maybe helps us understand it a little better than if we had nothing else but Joshua.
And with that historical note, especially drawing from the parallel, the Hittite parallel, we might actually then step back and look at the book more like the original readers did, the original hearers did, and maybe capture a different nuance than what we're used to.
Just as the creation story in Genesis is being told against the backdrop of these other creation gods, and the people of Israel says, no, it's our God, and this is the story, the true story that tells what's happened. So this land grant tells about how their God has given them land here that now belongs to them and their heritage.
Would you say that the book is history? I'm going to have several parts here, so don't answer right away. Is it history? Is it theology, a theological treatise? Is it a sermon to encourage? Is it some kind of literary genre that served a particular purpose? You talked about land grant, that's a possibility. Is there another way of thinking about this book that might help us when we start bumping into some of the challenges we face archaeologically?
I think it's all those things, you know. it's even more theology than it is history, although it certainly comes to us
Sure.
as history. But the point of it is theology.
Right.
It's God's giving this land to his people.
There's this interesting phrase that shows up regularly, especially in the first part of the book. Be courageous.
Right.
Don't be afraid. That message would have meant something to people in a number of different settings and could be then reused to give courage, especially when people saw threats to themselves, their communities, their land. This is what God gave them. Be strong, be courageous.
You know, they had been living with Moses for so long, through the time in Egypt and then the wilderness wanderings and then coming into the land of Transjordan, and he couldn't come with them across the river. It must really be worrisome to them to think, what's going to happen now? And so in a sense, this is presenting Joshua in a way that they can have confidence in. God has chosen him. He's going to be your leader. It's going to be successful. And so that's partly what's going on in this book.
I'm thinking of some of the accounts in Egypt, and one always has to ask, why is this story being told?
Right.
There's always a reason. There were many things which weren't written down.
Right.
And so I think asking the same questions of the book of Joshua is very helpful. And of course, people have said that history began with Herodotus, or maybe Thucydides, but an attempt of a long narrative, a story of the past.
Right.
But I think Joshua will have points that certainly archaeologists were very excited about looking for when they first began exploring the Holy Land. But we have to ask what the results of those explorations were.
And if the scholars, Old Testament scholars, are right, that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings form this history, this Deuteronomistic history based on the theology of Deuteronomy, which saw its final editing at another traumatic time,
Right.
the exile. What is it going to be like to go back after the exile? Be courageous, be strong. The Lord is giving you this land. That message would have been tremendously significant, it seems to me, even to an audience then. And we probably ought to keep that shaping in mind as we're thinking about the book now. I have thought about archaeology. We all have thought about archaeology and the Bible and the relationship they have. And we celebrate so much of what archaeology can do for our understanding of the Bible. When it comes to challenges, and we are going to see challenges in Joshua, archaeology in Joshua, I have thought about it in this way. Tell me if I'm right. Tell me, critique this. I see this as good news. What we normally think of good news, that matches, that's great. You know, you see it in the Bible, you see it in archaeology. And I don't use the word bad news. I think of it as potentially other good news. News that, while challenging, may force us to step back and rethink this, especially when the evidence becomes overwhelming, and maybe see something new, maybe expand our horizons, maybe actually discover something that could enrich our faith in a way that we might not imagine. So maybe when we approach it, you tell me if I'm right, if this makes sense. Good news and potentially good news. What do you think?
I like that, because the potentially good news often is thought of as bad news or critical or, you know, upsetting our theories and so on. But archaeology is like our glasses, isn't it? If you didn't have that and you're just reading the book and you take it for what it stands for, that's one way to do it. But archaeology has given us another way to look at it, and we see the same book through different eyes. And it's just as with science in the Bible. I mean, we need science and the Bible together to help us understand understand it holistically, and so archaeology does that for us with Joshua too.
What do you think? Are you going to go with me on this?
Yes, I think it would be fun to ask, after we discuss certain parts of Joshua, what is the good news about this potentially good news item.
Okay, we can do that.
I think that's a good frame.
We are going to turn to some slides and let the slides help us walk through a fascinating book. And what we want to do, now that we've talked about some basic literary categories and some challenges, let's look at the outline of the book. And typically, well, people outline biblical books in all kinds of different ways.
Sure.
And we try to make sense of them and organize them in ways that help us. They may not have meant the same thing to original writers and the audiences, but I think this is a fair outline. The first 8 chapters dedicated to Jericho and Ai. Now, that's 6 chapters. And all 6 of those chapters are permeated with, be courageous, be strong. You've got this enemy out there, but don't worry. God's on your side, be strong.
And it's the initial thrust of the Israelites into the land of Canaan, across the Jordan, right? And what happens to them in those first few weeks and months.
It's the closure of the wandering, really.
It is.
Because it begins with the Passover.
Right.
Think of the beginning of the Exodus.
Right. And remember, 2.5 tribes are left already in Transjordan. But the warriors from those 2.5 tribes are going with the people on a cross.
Significant transition, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's actually the first 6 chapters that get us to Jericho, but then 2 more for the conquest of Ai. I have put conquest with marks of quotation because I think as we talk about Joshua, that might, at least it has for a number of archaeologists, that the language has changed a bit to think about maybe the settlement, the taking over of. Conquest is pretty hard and harsh. Does the archaeological evidence suggest the same? How do we think about those?
Especially when you put it together with Judges, which we'll eventually do, but when you see those 2 books together, you have to put the conquest in quotes like you have. Yeah.
And it mentions they were able to hold the land or take it from the Canaanites. It's pretty clear that conquest needs to be looked at in the context of the whole story.
Right. And then the next section, chapters 9 through 12, that basically is the story that we think about with Joshua. So Joshua and the Israelites go to the south. They're in the central hill country by the end of chapter 8. They go to the south, that's a couple of chapters. They go to the north, that's a couple of chapters. So that by the time you have come to chapter 12, that's the end of the story as far as conquest or taking over the land is concerned. I think most of us think of the book of Joshua as all about these battles, but only the first part. And then we move to the division of the land, several chapters there, and then finally to several of Joshua's addresses at the end. So we dive in and we look at this particular picture, a satellite photo with the red enclosing actually the whole land that we're talking about here, including Jordan and Israel.
Right in the center of this picture is the Sinai Peninsula, isn't it? That has the 2 arms of the Red Sea. On the left, the Gulf of Suez, and on the right, the Gulf of Aqaba, but both part of the Red Sea that goes down to the south.
A different kind of picture. This is a satellite nighttime photo showing where population centers are by the intensity of the light.
Today.
And that's right. This is a few years ago, but it would be similar to today. And here is the Mediterranean Sea, and of course here's Palestine.
It's interesting how the Nile River shows up on that so clearly, because all the people are living on the river.
Almost the only place where people live in Egypt. And it does reflect ancient civilization too. It's desert everywhere else.
You can see what Herodotus meant when he said Egypt is the gift of the Nile.
So, and these arrows indicate at this time period, this transitional time period, the archaeological speak is late Bronze Age to early Iron Age. So we're talking somewhere around 1200. Some people would push it earlier to the 1400s or so. There's debate about that. In any case, a lot of movement. And notice a lot of movement into Palestine because of this power vacuum. There's nobody really in control. So you have Israelites coming in Exodus, you have people coming in from here, you have people, the Hittites, you have what people who become known as the Philistines and other Sea People groups. So a lot of movement heading toward the Promised Land. A lot of people thought about this as the Promised Land. A map. Talk to us about this map. What does it indicate about Canaan?
Well, these are the areas that are primary focus in the core areas of Joshua. So we see in the green, the central area.
Right.
This is what we call the highlands, or the central highlands of Israel. We could add the highlands of Transjordan if we
We
wish.
work in Jordan, so we tend to
think of
say
that too.
there's one over here too.
But the highlands were really the least settled during the previous time periods. And this is where the Israelites first moved to and began to settle down. And we see the villages crop up. So that's the core area. Of course, this is Samaria in the north, and the core area around Jerusalem in the south.
Right.
But then along the coast, we have the settlement area of the Philistines, who are really Greeks or Mycenaean type
Who've come from
peoples.
the Aegean Sea.
World, right. And the darker color is their initial settlement zone, so the 5 cities of the Philistines, the Pentapolis. And then they continue to push outwards.
Expanding.
And this is really where the two worlds of the Israelites in the highlands and the Philistines come together. And if you read the stories carefully, it's mostly along the river valleys going up into the highlands,
Right.
where the Israelites David has to fight them back.
And really, isn't there some indication that the Philistines are headed for Egypt? That's really where they would like to have gone.
Initially, yes.
But the Egyptians, keep them from coming in and taking over, and so they have to settle in the southern part of Palestine.
Right. So this gives us an idea. What we will be doing in the next few slides is visiting several sites. One of them is Chatzor or Hazor in the north. Another one is Beit El, the house of God, in the center part. And then Lachish down here in the south. Those are going to be the good news ones. Okay, we talk about good news and potentially good news. Others that we will visit, we will look at Jericho, we will look at Ai, and we will look at Heshbon or Heshbon. And they're going to be the potentially good news ones as we think about them. And then I think that will lead us to consider suggestions that scholars have made about how it is that we match these things together. Jericho. Larry, you're probably the first one to have visited Jericho. Is it the size of New York, like we kind of think?
I think it's about 7 acres in size, so
large.
it's not very large. And you see the whole thing there. You see the road that goes from top to bottom alongside the Tel, and across the road in that green area is where Elisha's spring is. There's stories about that in the Bible too. So you can already see from that picture that Jericho has been worked over by many different archaeological expeditions starting in the 1800s and coming right down to the present. Yeah.
So archaeologically, what do we know? If we're trying to think about the story of the conquest of Jericho, what do we know archaeologically about the site?
Well, when archaeologists first started going to Palestine to excavate biblical sites, of course Jericho was very high on the list, there was great enthusiasm. So if you look back at the records, we have a sequence of excavators, and early on the large walls were found, and these were massive. They fit the picture, sort of like going to Troy. Schliemann dug for the city that looked like what he was expecting. And these walls were what we would call Middle Bronze walls, maybe dating to 1550, 1600.
Right, a little bit early.
Yeah,
That's where we date them now.
That's how we date them now.
Yeah.
Initially, they weren't dated to that. It was dated to the Exodus. It was dated by the text to, 1440, 1400.
And Garstang was the director and the excavator at that time. He ended up being the director of antiquities for the state of Palestine under the British. So he was really a very credible person who came from England and excavated and was sure that he had found the walls of Joshua.
And the publications, the popular publications just
Picked up on
shouted
it, sure.
this news.
So it seemed like the ideal site to prove that the Bible is true.
Right.
Until
The 50s.
Kathleen Kenyon,
Kathleen
another
Kenyon.
British person, went there and excavated. And she was a careful stratigrapher, paying very careful attention to the sequence of layers. And she came to the conclusion that the walls were too early to match with any of the possible dates for the Exodus, the most popular period, or other ones around that time. So that left the biblical connection between the city and the ruins, or the story and the ruins, in question.
Right.
And she argued that there wasn't much of a city there during the period.
Squatters' huts,
Yeah,
I think is the word she uses.
Yeah, small village.
So this is not the big walled city. These are just little huts that were there. That's significant. This is potentially good news. How are we to put this together? We'll not finish all of this for this episode, and we'll have to continue the discussion for the next one. But how are we to put this together? How are we to understand this disconnect between the archaeological record and the biblical record?
Well, you asked me when I first visited the site. One of the first times was with Dr. Siegfried Horn, who is somebody that we're all indebted to, Mr. Archaeology in the Adventist Church. And this was in the 50s, and we visited this site. And here's how he explained what was going on, that as we look at the site, there's sort of a curve here, and the higher part of the tell, or the mound, is here. And they didn't build as high here because they were trying to protect the spring that was over here. And when this site was destroyed by the Israelites, the Bible tells us it wasn't rebuilt for 300 years, down the time of Ahab. And so perhaps the latest part of the tell, that's the late Bronze Age, which would be contemporary with Joshua, maybe sort of sloughed off as it slid down from the higher part to the lower, and then it was all plowed under and so on. And so his explanation was the upper part has been lost because it was open for 300 years. Yeah.
Kent, where would most archaeologists go today?
Well, there's been a long dialogue about possible resolutions. Some have tried to bring the sequence down into correlation with the biblical text. By and large, I think many archaeologists have just left this as
a difficulty that has unresolved.
An unresolved difficulty, yeah. Right. And it's something that we just sort of have to hold and realize that we don't have all of the, perhaps all of the answers right now, but we can begin to try to integrate it with the text.
Another thing that I know Dr. Horn mentioned was that, as you can see from the top of the slide over there, we're right up against the hills nearby, and there are burial caves in those, and some of the objects that were found may go back to the time.
And we will have occasion to come back to this. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, Larry. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this has proved helpful to you in your knowledge and in your faith. And we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.